nobody has gotten by with the kind of money printing we're doing now for a very extended period without some trouble. And I think we're very near the edge of playing with fire.
Hey guys, my name is Travis. If you're new around here, I like talking about investing or anything to do with building wealth. If you want to hear more about topics like these, make sure to subscribe. So lately, for anyone that's actually paying attention, people are scared of two things right now. One is inflation, and two is an economic crash. As far as inflation, this makes total sense considering the fact that we're about to double the amount of cash in active circulation over the past year alone. That is absolutely mind-blowing. Well, I've been considering making a video about us possibly having higher inflation in the future for a while now, but I just so happened to run into Jake Tran's video, Why Haven't We Seen Hyperinflation? And it really caught my attention. After watching this, I really thought that me adding my own commentary onto this video and expanding on a few topics might really help you guys learn more about the possibility of us having higher inflation in the future. This will give you guys some clarity as to what's really going on and why people are so worried about inflation. Keep in mind, I'm not including Jake Tran's entire video in this video, so make sure to check it out. I've linked it below. So let's jump into it.
Germany, June 1921 to November 1923. Highest monthly inflation rate, over 30,000%. Time required for prices to double, every few days. During World War I, like many countries, Germany, then called the Weimar Republic, suspended its gold standard to fund the war effort, based on the belief that they were going to win the war and pay for it by plundering their enemies. That plan obviously didn't work out, so after the war, they were left shackled with not only their own war debts, but were also fined 132 billion gold marks in reparations by the Treaty of Versailles. The equivalent of about $269 billion today. The first payment of that war guilt came due in June 1921. The problem was the treaty didn't allow Germany to make payments in its own currency, so Germany had no choice but to exchange their German marks for other respected currencies at really bad exchange rates. So what was the solution? Well, we're off the gold standard, so let's just print more money. And print they did. That printed money was used to buy foreign currency, that foreign currency was used to pay off their war reparations, and soon Germany was buying foreign currency at any price because why not? All they had to do was print more money, so in just a little over a year later, the German mark was already practically worthless. A $50,000 bill turned into a $500,000 bill, to a $5 million bill, to a $50 million bill, to $500 million, to $5 billion, to $50 billion, to $500 billion, to $5 trillion, to a $50 trillion bill. Bills that were worth more of its weight as wood fire than as a medium of exchange. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks by the end of 1922 skyrocketed to 200 billion marks just a year later. Although Germany was the most infamous case of hyperinflation, it is far from the worst. Hungary, August 1945 to July 1946. Highest monthly rate of inflation, 4.19 times 10 to the 16th power, or this giant number. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 207%. Time required for prices to double, 15 hours. After World War II, like many countries, Hungary was left in shambles. Their industries were crippled, and what remained of their assets were seized by both sides of the war. So the amount of goods produced went down, but the amount of money in circulation stayed the same. So, inflation.
Okay, so what he just said is really important, but he said it very briefly. The amount of goods that were being produced in the economy was going down, but the amount of money in circulation was staying the same. The problem with that is a lot of people think of inflation as simply there's too much money being printed and there's too much money in circulation. That can cause inflation. That's what everybody's worried about right now. But in this case, what was going on was it's really a ratio between what are the amount of assets that are being produced compared to how many dollars, the number that is in circulation. Well, the amount of goods can go down, but the number of dollar bills in circulation stays the same, which would also cause inflation. So essentially, it's just a ratio between the two. So theoretically, let's just pretend that there was a pandemic that somehow made the amount of production around the world decrease. What would be the issue is, theoretically, if the amount of dollars in circulation stayed the same, but the amount that was being produced decreased, all of a sudden you're going to have increased prices of goods. I hope that makes sense.
But instead of trying to reduce the inflation by reducing the amount of money in circulation, which could have made the already dead economy worse, Hungary took a different approach. The government intentionally caused inflation by printing literally as much money as they could. What started out as 25 billion penge in July 1945 grew to 1.6 trillion penge 6 months later. Then just 4 months after that, the money supply grew to 65 quadrillion. At one point, the government had to stop collecting taxes, because if they were late by just 1 day, it would have wiped out the value of the taxes the government collected. Needless to say, this would go down in history as the worst case of hyperinflation ever.
So one more thing, just in case you don't know, the government wants inflation for many reasons, but one of the many reasons that inflation is beneficial in a way to the US government, or any government, is that it helps pay off debt. So for example, say I owed $100 to my brother. We'll say that there's 10% inflation every single year. That $100 that I owe him is now worth less and less money. So it's a way to basically not pay off your debt.
Imagine the money you have in your bank account right now, then imagine moving the decimal point 22 places to the left. Then imagine trying to buy something. Then imagine trying to survive through this for 2 years straight, from the start of 2020 to the end of 2021, for example.
Imagine trying to save money.
The general rule of thumb is that hyperinflation is when the monthly inflation rate is above 50%. And since 1998, Zimbabwe has been hovering around a 50%.
Remember that number. He said that in general, the definition of hyperinflation is 50% every month.
Annual inflation rate. Mix in Zimbabwe's central bank continuing to tinker with the economy to try to slow down inflation, and by March 2007, the country was experiencing full-blown hyperinflation. Venezuela, 2013 to today. A situation caused by both political and economic reasons that range from the government controlling parts of the economy, shortages of food, electricity, medicine, riots and political instability that stem from that, oil revenue tanking even though they have some of the largest oil reserves on the planet.
Gasoline has been in short supply there for years.
Fun fact, my roommate gets tutoring from people online, and a lot of the tutors are from Venezuela because it's the best way for them to make money, because they make money in the US dollar rather than Venezuelan currency. And regularly his tutoring gets postponed because randomly the power will go out and people just can't talk to him online.
Which brings us to today, in the West.
Just because you're printing money doesn't
The
mean
United
there's more
States,
stuff.
January 6, 2020 to January 4, 2021. Coming straight from the Fed, we started this period with around $4 trillion in the system. 1 year later, that number is at $6.7 trillion. Meaning that over 40% of all US dollars were printed in just the last 12 months.
So 41%, sorry, I don't remember what I said at the very beginning of the video, but
we've had an incredible surge in
41%.
government spending. A lot of it related, of course, to COVID-19 and to the ordered, economic shutdown, and the fact that a lot of people were no longer out there earning money. And so the government looked to replace what people were no longer earning by printing money, which is what they did. You had all this government spending, but there were no additional tax hikes to cover the cost, nor did the government try to prioritize any of its spending. It didn't say, well, maybe we should spend less on the military so we have more to spend on fighting the pandemic, right? They didn't budget their resources. They just said, well, we're just going to spend more money on the pandemic, but we're not going to spend less on anything else, and we're not going to raise anybody's taxes to pay for it. So where'd all the government spending come from? It doesn't come from, thin air. The money has to come from somewhere. And if they're not going to make room in the budget by cutting spending, if they're not going to increase taxes to get additional revenue, well, then they just crank up the printing presses. So that's where all this new money came from.
So this is something that a lot of people don't understand. I have a lot of friends that believe that these stimulus checks are coming out of our taxes, essentially. And that might be the case in the future, but I'll talk about that at the end of the video. That might be the case in the future, but as of right now, that's not the case. We're simply printing money, or essentially clicking a button, because obviously now it's not actually printing in the form of dollars. They just print money in the form of a click.
The government printed it and spent it into circulation through all these programs.
And from the looks of it, no one seems to be in a rush to slow things down.
A sweeping nearly $2 trillion relief package to tackle this pandemic, one of the largest in our nation's history.
In fact, no one is really talking about this at all.
And right now, nobody seems to think that this is a problem.
People seem to think that we've stumbled on the equivalent of a monetary fountain of youth. People like to call it modern monetary theory, which is we can have whatever we want as long as government prints the money to pay for it. That there's no limit. That government is free as long as they print money. Now, of course.
And strangely enough, we haven't seen much inflation for everyday goods like gas and food, so the question remains, where's the inflation? People don't want to spend money right now if they don't know if they're going to be able to keep their job or find a new one. But you know what they are going to spend money on? Things that only go up, like Tesla stock, every other stock, real estate, and Bitcoin. So we are seeing plenty.
This is a very good point. Notice how since the pandemic, all assets, despite things like unemployment being at an all-time high, all asset classes are skyrocketing. So the market, the stock market is at an all-time high. Cryptocurrency is at an all-time high. That does not surprise me whatsoever. Real estate prices are at an all-time high. Anything that really is a store of value is at an all-time high, probably because everybody has extra money from these stimulus checks in their pocket. And on top of that, you're not spending as much money. You're not going out to eat or anything else. So what do you do with that money? You don't spend it. You invest it. Here where I'm from, buying real estate, buying a home is nearly impossible because there's simply not enough supply on the market. People will pay virtually anything to buy a home because interest rates are at an all-time low and they have more money in their pocket. And as far as cryptocurrency, of course cryptocurrency is skyrocketing. People are scared of the US dollar inflating in value, and they think that that can protect them from that. Yeah, it's a pretty unfortunate situation.
Happening right now. The S&P 500 has seen around a 70% increase since its crash in March, the same exact period all these new US dollars were printed. Home prices have gone up by 8% since January, which is higher than usual, and pretty much everyone and their mom knows how well Bitcoin has been doing. But instead of calling it inflation, we call it the stock market rally, the real estate boom, crypto's time to shine, or the great crypto bubble, depending on who you ask.
When inflation pushes up asset prices, people don't complain because the people that own those assets, of course, feel much richer.
Right now, the downward pressures are counteracting the upward pressures, and we are in a fragile equilibrium.
Yeah, so basically everyone right now feels like a genius if they invested in essentially any asset class. So like the stock market, crypto, real estate, you feel like a genius because you had your money invested during a time when on paper, all of these assets are skyrocketing in value. Well, in my opinion, the value really hasn't increased very much. It's just showing up on paper that they have because it's matching the rate of inflation, essentially. But really, the biggest losers here are people that don't have their money invested in any sort of asset because they're not keeping up with inflation. Eventually, it will show up in the price of goods, and on top of that, they're going to miss out on the growth that could have occurred if they had invested their money into the stock market or crypto or real estate.
Should the money printer keep going burr? Can it keep going burr?
And I ultimately think we're going to see a real shock in terms of how high consumer prices are going to rise.
So you think that's how it's going to end up with all this money printing? It's eventually going to hit consumer prices?
Well, it always does. I mean, that's like the final resting place for inflation is in the end product.
The government can't run out of finance,
Right.
but the United States could run out of resources that are available.
So just in case you guys don't understand how the government actually gets this money printed and into the economy, so on those basic level, Congress passes a bill that tells the Treasury to issue debt because it needs funds right now. So it tells the Treasury to issue debt in the form of bonds, bills, and notes. Those bonds, bills, and notes are basically IOUs to the people from the government, and the government has to pay the people back at a later date. But naturally, there aren't millions of people waiting around to buy trillions of dollars worth of bonds. So what does the government have to do? Well, the Fed then prints trillions of dollars and uses that printed money to then buy those bonds, bills, and notes from the Treasury. So now all of a sudden the Fed has trillions of dollars worth of bonds that it just bought from the Treasury, and the Treasury now has the funds that it needs to stimulate the economy.
And the fact of the matter is, this is kinda how the world works right now.
People think that we're describing a new policy. We're not. We are describing reality. We're describing the way the US government spends, the way the British government spends.
Our brains have not evolved very much in the last 10,000 years. That means that the same humans that caused all the other examples of hyperinflation, those same politicians with the same incentives that led to those disasters, are the same humans in our government today, with similar incentives. Are those really the people you want in control of the printing press?
So I agree with him in the sense that yes, they do have similar incentives today, but to their credit, modern day we have a lot more information on the effects of printing and inflation on the economy. Despite how idiotic we all believe our politicians are, I don't think that they're unaware of these facts. I think they're aware of what could happen as a result of printing money and what will happen if we continue to print money at this rate. At least, I hope that they're aware of that.
So before this interview, before this video, I really tried to understand the other side of the argument, the modern monetary theorists. On the surface, it kind of makes sense. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, it doesn't make sense beneath the surface, and it doesn't make sense on the surface either. Like, no matter where you go relative to the surface, it doesn't make any sense. But what is true, though, is that if a government borrows in its own currency, yes, it can go deeper into debt before suffering the consequences of its profligacy than a country that's borrowing in somebody else's currency that it can't print. So the day of reckoning will come later for a country that's borrowing in its own currency. But because the day of reckoning comes later, the problems get much bigger before that happens. So that means the ultimate consequences are much more severe. So you get away with it for a little longer, but then the pain is worse when you no longer get away with it. Because the idea that you get away with it indefinitely is nonsense, right? The bills have...
So basically, eventually, we're going to have to pay in two ways. Either A, we pay in taxes, or B, we pay for inflation. Taxes is going to disproportionately affect people who are wealthy. Inflation is going to affect essentially everyone equally, not necessarily because it's a ratio. So we're going to have to pay up in one of those two ways. And I have a strong feeling we're not going to be paying up in the form of taxes.
Got to be paid eventually. And the longer you procrastinate paying them, the bigger the bill's going to be. But when the government just prints money and gives it to you, right? When you have all these unemployed people who are sitting at home just getting a check from the government, they produced nothing. They added no goods or services to the economy, yet they can consume goods and services in the same proportions as if somebody had actually done work and actually been, a productive member of society. All this does is drive up prices.
What he just said is so important.
Because if your work adds to the goods and services, and now you're consuming the goods and services you help create, that's fine. But if now you start consuming goods and services, yet you didn't help create any of those goods and services, you just have more money chasing a diminished supply of goods and services, and prices are going to go up. And they're going to go up like never before. And the irony of all of this is that the Federal Reserve has been promising Americans more inflation. Well, that's one promise that they're going to deliver on. In fact, they're going to deliver on it beyond their wildest expectations.
You can print money to pay for products, but if no one's around to actually create the products, what happens? The price goes up.
So do you think there's ever going to be a time where they're going to slow down the money printer, or is it just going to continue forever?
Well, they can't do it forever because at some point the money has no value. And, there's not much sense in printing money that buys nothing. So at some point they're going to have to turn off the presses. And in fact, hopefully at some point they're going to slow them down quite a bit. But, we'll see how long they can resist doing that, because doing it involves a lot of pain, short-term pain, economically, politically, that our leaders really don't want. And of course, if you look at all of the promises that they've made to the voters that can't possibly be paid for, rather than admit that none of this can is affordable, they can just print the money and act as if, the government can provide these things. There's a good chance that they're going to push this as far as they can. I mean, until the dollar has completely collapsed, and then they just can't get away with it anymore.
So this is the one point that I disagree with. I don't think that the US dollar will collapse, because that's going to imply hyperinflation. And as stated beforehand, hyperinflation is whenever you have 50% inflation in a month. I don't think that we're going to get to that point. I do think that we're going to see increased inflation. That is going to be an issue, and which is why I'm saying invest your money. But at the same time, I don't think it will collapse. I don't think that our government will let that happen. Maybe I have blind faith, but I don't believe that's going to happen.
There's really no incentive for anybody to change.
Yeah.
Because as long as they can print money and people will accept it and the value doesn't go down too much, well, they'll just keep doing it rather than being honest with the public and accepting the consequences.
Wow. Unbelievable. I mean, that video is great, and Jake Tran nailed it as far as summarizing all of the threats that are involved in doing this kind of printing. And the saddest part is this is happening all around the world. It's not just the US government, unfortunately. So despite all this turmoil, I really don't recommend doing anything drastic. In my opinion, if you keep your money invested at all times, you'll be okay. If you have your money in assets, you'll be preserving your wealth. So keep your money in the stock market, and don't get me wrong, the stock market will be affected. Inflation, hyperinflation, is not good for anyone, including businesses. But still, you will be preserving your wealth in the long run. Same with real estate. And I hate to say it, but cryptocurrency might be a decent option. The problem with cryptocurrency is you have no idea what it's truly worth. So you could be buying at an all-time high. Unfortunately, I can't help you there. But honestly, the worst case scenario is that you have your money in cash. It'll be affected by any inflation that's coming, whether that's hyperinflation or just a higher inflation rate. So in conclusion, I don't believe that we're going to see hyperinflation, which is 50% a month, which is just drastic. But I do think that our inflation rate will increase. I think it has to, because God knows we're not going to be paying for all this in taxes. And again, I did not use all of Jake Tran's video, so make sure to check it out. I linked it below. So please subscribe to my channel. It would really help me out. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Attention young men and women, subscribe to Travis White's channel. He needs your help to defeat the evil, broke YouTuber depression.